Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the remarkable world of the Ottoman Empire, not through the eyes of sultans and grand viziers, but through the daily experiences of ordinary people who walk the streets of Istanbul, Damascus, Cairo, and hundreds of other cities across 3 continents. From sunrise prayers to midnight marketplace gossip, from the aromatic coffee houses to the steaming hammams, their stories reveal a civilization far more complex, colourful, and surprisingly modern than most history books would have you believe. So before we begin this journey through time, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy exploring the hidden corners of history. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what draws you to Ottoman history. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together over these stories. Now, settle in, maybe grab some Turkish coffee if you have it, and let's step through the gates of time into the bustling world of the Ottoman Empire. When the morning call to prayer echoed across Ottoman cities just before dawn, it wasn't just a religious summons. It was the empire's alarm clock setting millions of lives into motion across 3 continents. Picture this. You're living in the 16th century Istanbul, and the first sound you hear isn't your neighbour's rooster, or the clatter of cartwheels, but the melodious voice of the muezzin floating down from the nearest minaret, weaving through narrow streets and open windows, gently pulling an entire city from its slumber. The Ottoman day began early, and I mean early. While we might grumble about our 6 a.m. alarms, Ottoman citizens were already washing their faces with rosewater and preparing for the day by 4 or 5 a.m. There was no snooze button in the Ottoman Empire. When the call to prayer rang out, the day had officially begun, whether you were ready or not. But here's what's remarkable. This wasn't seen as a burden. The pre-dawn hours were considered blessed, a time when the air was cleanest, the mind clearest, and the connection between earth and heaven strongest. Merchants would already be heading to their shops, bakers would have been up for hours preparing the day's bread, and even children would be rubbing sleep from their eyes, preparing for a full day that wouldn't end until well after sunset. The morning routine of an average Ottoman household was both practical and ritualistic. First came the ablutions, not just a quick splash of water on the face, but a careful cleansing ritual that served both spiritual and hygienic purposes. The Ottomans were remarkably advanced in their understanding of cleanliness, with most homes having special areas designated for washing, and public fountains on nearly every street corner. Breakfast wasn't the rushed affair we know today. Ottoman families gathered around low tables or large copper trays, sharing a meal that might seem unusual to modern eyes, but was perfectly balanced for the day ahead. Fresh bread, still warm from the neighbourhood baker, formed the foundation, accompanied by white cheese, olives, honey, and perhaps some dried fruits. The wealthy might add eggs or sukuk, a spiced sausage that would make your mouth water, while poorer families made do with bread, olive oil, and whatever vegetables were in season. Tea wasn't the Ottoman morning drink. That honour belonged to a light soup called chorba, which warmed the stomach and prepared it for the day's work. Coffee, that legendary Ottoman contribution to world culture, was saved for later in the day, a social drink rather than a morning necessity. Children in Ottoman households didn't lounge around watching the Ottoman equivalent of Saturday morning cartoons. By age 6 or 7, boys were either heading to the local mektep primary school to learn reading, writing, and Quranic recitation, or beginning apprenticeships in their father's trade. Girls learned household management from their mothers, though many also received education in reading and basic arithmetic. The Ottomans weren't as restrictive about female education as many assume. The streets would fill quickly after morning prayer. Shopkeepers threw open their shutters with theatrical flair, displaying their wares like actors setting a stage. The bread sellers' cry of "Sıcak ekmek," hot bread, competed with the water carriers' jingling bells and the distinctive calls of the yogurt vendors. Each trade had its own unique call, creating a morning symphony that regular residents could navigate with their eyes closed. What strikes me most about Ottoman mornings is how communal they were. Unlike our modern rush to get out the door with a coffee in hand and earbuds firmly in place, Ottomans began their day with connection. Neighbours greeted each other from windows and doorways, sharing news, gossip, and sometimes breakfast items. The local coffee house, yes, they had coffee houses long before Starbucks was even a dream, would already be filling with early customers, not for takeaway cups, but for leisurely conversation before the workday truly began. The morning prayer wasn't just about religion, it synchronized an entire empire. From Belgrade to Baghdad, From Cairo to Crimea, millions of people were starting their day at roughly the same time, following similar routines, bound together by shared customs that transcended ethnic and linguistic differences. It was social engineering through daily rhythm, creating unity in an empire that spanned 3 continents and dozens of cultures. The fascinating thing about Ottoman mornings was how they balanced efficiency with leisure. Yes, people rose early and got to work quickly, but there was no sense of the frantic rush we associate with modern mornings. A merchant might spend an hour setting up his shop while chatting with neighbouring shopkeepers. A craftsman would carefully inspect his tools while sharing tea with his apprentices. Even the busiest Ottoman official would take time for proper ablutions and prayer rather than rushing through them. This early morning period also served as an informal news network. In an era before newspapers, though the Ottomans would eventually have those too, information travelled through morning conversations. A baker might hear from a customer about a new shipment arriving at the port, pass it on to the spice merchant next door, who would tell the coffeehouse owner, and by noon, half the city would know. It was social media, 16th century style, powered by human connection rather than fibre optic cables. The Ottoman morning routine reveals something profound about their society. They understood that how you start your day determines how you live your life. By beginning with cleanliness, prayer, communal breakfast, and neighbourly connection, they set a tone of mindfulness and community that carried through the entire day. They weren't just going through motions, they were actively creating the rhythm of their civilization, one morning at a time. If you wanted to understand Ottoman society, really understand it, you wouldn't go to the palace or the mosque first. You'd go to the marketplace, where the true heartbeat of the empire pulsed from dawn to dusk. The Ottoman bazaar wasn't just a place to shop, it was theatre, social club, news centre, and economic engine all rolled into one spectacular sensory experience. Walking into a major Ottoman bazaar, let's say Istanbul's Grand Bazaar in its heyday, was like entering another world. The moment you passed through one of its many gates, you were hit with a wall of sensation. The air thick with the scent of cinnamon, saffron and leather. The sound of hundreds of voices haggling in Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Armenian, and a dozen other languages. The visual feast of carpets hanging like tapestries, copper pots gleaming like treasure, and pyramids of colourful spices that look too perfect to be real. But here's what most people don't realise. The Ottoman marketplace was incredibly organised. What looked like chaos to an outsider was actually a carefully choreographed commercial dance that had been perfected over centuries. Each trade had its own section: the street of the goldsmiths, the row of the carpet sellers, the corner of the spice merchants. This wasn't random. It was regulated by the guild system, one of the most sophisticated commercial organisations in pre-modern history. The guilds were like medieval corporations with a social conscience. Every craftsman and merchant belonged to one, from the mighty silk traders to the humble water carriers. These weren't just trade associations. They were entire social systems that regulated quality, set prices, provided social insurance, and even arranged marriages. If you were a coppersmith, your guild was your professional family, your safety net, and your pathway to success all in one. The shopping experience in an Ottoman bazaar was nothing like our modern grab-and-go culture. Bargaining wasn't just accepted, it was expected, even required. To pay the first price offered was considered almost insulting. It suggested you thought the merchant was trying to cheat you, or worse, that you didn't respect the ancient dance of negotiation. A proper bargaining session was an art form. It might start with the merchant offering tea, always tea, never rushed, always ceremonial. You'd sit on cushions in his shop, surrounded by his wares, and begin the delicate process of negotiation. He'd start impossibly high, you'd counter impossibly low, and slowly, through a series of theatrical protests, feigned departures, and dramatic returns, you'd arrive at a price that left both parties feeling victorious. This might take an hour for a significant purchase, and nobody thought that was strange. Time moved differently in the Ottoman marketplace. The idea of rushing through a transaction to save time would have seemed not just rude, but almost incomprehensible. The transaction was the relationship, and the relationship was everything. The marketplace also served as the empire's informal banking system. Major merchants extended credit, held deposits, and even transferred money across vast distances through a sophisticated system of letters of credit called suftaja. a merchant in Cairo could write a note that would be honoured by his colleague in Istanbul, creating an early form of international banking that predated modern systems by centuries. But the bazaar wasn't just about buying and selling, it was the empire's primary social space, especially for men. The coffee houses scattered throughout the market served as informal clubs where merchants gathered to discuss business, politics and philosophy. These weren't quick coffee breaks. A merchant might spend 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon sipping coffee, smoking a water pipe, and engaging in the kind of networking that would make modern LinkedIn seem primitive. The Ottoman marketplace was also remarkably inclusive for its time. While different religions and ethnicities had their own sections and specialties, Armenian jewellers, Greek furriers, Jewish physicians, they all operated under the same commercial laws and guild protections. A Christian merchant had the same rights in the bazaar as a Muslim one, protected by Ottoman commercial law that was surprisingly progressive for its era. Women in the marketplace occupied a fascinating position. While elite women might send servants to shop for them, middle-class and working women were common sights in the bazaar, especially in certain sections. There were even female merchants, particularly in textiles and cosmetics. The fabric sellers section would be crowded with women examining silks and cottons with expert eyes, haggling just as fiercely as any man, though perhaps with more subtle tactics. The marketplace was where the empire's incredible diversity was most visible. A single transaction might involve a Turkish merchant selling Indian spices to an Arab customer, using Byzantine gold coins, with the deal witnessed by an Armenian scribe, all under laws derived from Islamic jurisprudence, but influenced by Roman commercial practice. It was globalization, centuries before we coined the term. Quality control in the Ottoman marketplace was surprisingly strict. The mutasib, or market inspector, would make regular rounds, checking weights and measures, testing the quality of goods, and punishing those who tried to cheat customers. Bakers who sold underweight bread might find their loaves nailed to their shop door as a warning. Spice merchants who adulterated their goods could be expelled from the guild entirely, essentially ending their career. The bazaar even had its own emergency services. Fires were a constant danger in these crowded spaces full of flammable goods, so each section had its own firefighting equipment and trained volunteers. There were also unofficial police, usually guild members who kept order and settled disputes before they escalated. As the day progressed, the character of the marketplace would shift. Mornings were for serious shopping, housewives buying provisions, restaurants stocking up, craftsmen purchasing materials. Afternoons became more leisurely, with more browsing, more tea drinking, more social visiting. By evening, as the call to prayer echoed through the covered passages, the bazaar would begin to wind down, though some sections, particularly those selling food, might stay open well into the night. The Ottoman marketplace was more than just a commercial centre. It was the empire's living room, its newspaper, its social club, and its economic heart all in one. It was where cultures met, ideas were exchanged, and the incredible diversity of the empire wasn't just tolerated but celebrated and monetized. The bazaar was proof that commerce, when done right, could be a force for civilization itself. If the marketplace was the Ottoman Empire's beating heart, the coffee house was its living room, its newspaper, and its social media platform all rolled into one aromatic, animated space. The Ottomans didn't just drink coffee, they created an entire civilization around it, transforming a bitter bean from Ethiopia into the centerpiece of one of history's most influential social institutions. Coffee arrived in Istanbul around 1540, brought by Ottoman merchants who had discovered it in Yemen. Within a decade, the first coffee house opened near the port, and within a generation they were everywhere. By the 17th century, Istanbul alone had over 600 coffee houses, each with its own character, clientele, and unwritten rules of engagement. Walking into an Ottoman coffee house was like entering a carefully orchestrated social performance. The space itself was designed for lingering. Low-cushioned benches called seders lined the walls, small tables scattered throughout, and if the establishment was particularly fancy, perhaps a fountain bubbling in the centre. The walls might be decorated with calligraphy, the windows covered with intricate wooden screens that let in light but maintained privacy. The coffee itself was an art form. Ottoman coffee, what we now call Turkish coffee, wasn't just a drink. It was a ritual. The beans were roasted fresh daily, ground to a powder finer than flour, then carefully brewed in a long-handled copper pot called a sezve. The kavesi, coffee maker, would watch the brew like a hawk, removing it from the heat at just the right moment to preserve the foam on top, which was considered the mark of properly made coffee. But here's what's fascinating. In Ottoman coffee houses, you didn't just order coffee. There were gradations and preferences as complex as any modern coffee menu. You might order your coffee shekeli, sweet, az shekeli, slightly sweet, or said, plain. Some preferred it flavoured with cardamom or mastic. The wealthy might have ambergris added. Yes, the stuff from Wales, which was believed to be an aphrodisiac. The coffee house served other drinks too. There was boza, a slightly fermented millet drink that was technically almost alcoholic, but officially wasn't. Sherbet, flavoured with fruits and flowers, provided a sweet alternative. And of course, there was tea, though it wouldn't become the Ottoman favourite until much later. But people didn't come to coffee houses just for the drinks. These were the empire's information networks, more efficient than any government intelligence service. A merchant could learn about price fluctuations in distant markets. A craftsman could hear about new techniques from foreign lands, and everyone could catch up on the latest palace gossip, filtered through several layers of exaggeration. Different coffee houses catered to different crowds. There were literary coffee houses where poets would compete in improvisation contests, their verses becoming more elaborate, and possibly more ridiculous, as the evening wore on. Musicians had their own establishments where they could try out new compositions. The janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, had their coffee houses where they would gather to grumble about pay and plot the occasional revolution. The entertainment in coffee houses was as varied as their clientele. Shadow puppet shows called karagöz would lampoon everyone from corrupt officials to nagging wives, using humour to say things that couldn't be said directly. Professional storytellers called medas would hold audiences spellbound for hours with tales that mixed history, mythology, and current events into narratives that would make modern Netflix series seem simple. Gaming was huge in Ottoman coffee houses. Backgammon boards clicked constantly. Chess games could last for days with spectators betting on the outcome, and card games, despite being technically frowned upon, were common. The Ottomans even developed their own board games like Mangala, which required mathematical thinking and strategic planning that would impress modern game theorists. The coffee house was also where business happened. Merchants would meet potential partners, contracts would be negotiated, and deals would be sealed with a handshake and another round of coffee. Some coffee houses even served as informal employment agencies where skilled workers could find patrons, and unemployed men could hear about opportunities. But not everyone loved coffee houses. Religious conservatives worried they were keeping people from prayers. Government officials suspected they were hotbeds of sedition. They weren't wrong. And social critics complained they were destroying family life by keeping men away from home. Sultan Murad IV actually banned coffee houses in 1633, claiming they were fire hazards. The real reason? He was worried about the political discussions happening inside them. The ban didn't last. Ottomans loved their coffee too much, and more importantly, the coffee houses were too essential to the empire's social and economic functioning. They reopened within a few years, and sultans learned to use them rather than fight them, planting spies to gauge public opinion, and sometimes spreading their own propaganda through strategic conversations. Women had a complex relationship with coffee houses. While they generally didn't frequent the main establishments, that would have been socially unacceptable, they had their own coffee culture. Wealthy women held elaborate coffee parties in their homes, complete with professional entertainment and fortune-telling from coffee grounds. Some bathhouses had attached coffee rooms where women could socialise freely. The coffee house even influenced Ottoman architecture and urban planning. They were typically located at strategic points, near mosques for the after-prayer crowd, in bazaars for merchants taking breaks, and along major thoroughfares for travellers. The best locations were those with a view, either of the Bosphorus in Istanbul or of busy streets where patrons could watch the world go by. As evening approached, coffee houses would transform. The daytime crowd of merchants and craftsmen would give way to intellectuals, artists, and what we might call bohemians today. The conversations would shift from commerce to philosophy, from gossip to poetry. Oil lamps would be lit, casting shadows that danced with the smoke from water pipes, creating an atmosphere that was part salon, part theatre. The Ottoman coffee house created a unique form of democracy. Inside, a humble craftsman could sit next to a wealthy merchant, sharing the same space, drinking the same coffee, engaging in the same conversations. Social hierarchies didn't disappear, but they were temporarily softened by the egalitarian nature of caffeine and conversation. The influence of Ottoman coffee houses spread far beyond the empire's borders. When Ottoman ambassadors brought coffee to Vienna, Paris and London, they brought coffee house culture with them. The European coffee houses that would later foster the Enlightenment, house stock exchanges and birth insurance companies all traced their ancestry back to these Ottoman originals. By creating spaces where people could gather, talk, think and argue outside the constraints of home, mosque or palace, the Ottomans invented something revolutionary: the public sphere. The coffee house was where civil society was born, one cup at a time. If coffee houses were where Ottoman men built their social world, the Hammam, the Turkish bath, was where the entire society went to get clean, catch up on gossip, and engage in the kind of social bonding that kept communities together. But these weren't just places to wash. They were architectural marvels, social institutions, and health centres, all rolled into one steamy, sudsy package. The Ottoman approach to bathing was nothing like the quick shower we're used to today. A proper Hammam visit was an event, a ritual that could easily consume half a day. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about transformation, entering dirty and stressed, emerging clean, relaxed and socially reconnected. The architecture of a hammam was ingenious. Built from stone with domed ceilings, they used an underground heating system called a hypocaust, inherited from the Romans but perfected by the Ottomans. Hot air from furnaces would circulate under the marble floors and through the walls, creating different temperature zones that bathers would move through like a carefully choreographed dance. You'd enter through the kamikan, a grand reception area with a fountain in the centre and private changing cubicles around the edges. This wasn't just a locker room, it was a social space where people would linger before and after bathing, drinking tea, playing backgammon, sometimes even conducting business deals while wrapped in nothing but towels. From there, you'd move to the sokluk, the warm room, where your body would begin to adjust to the heat. This transitional space was crucial. Rushing straight from the cold outside to the hot bath was considered dangerous to one's health. The Ottomans understood the importance of gradual temperature change centuries before modern sports science discovered the same principle. The main event was the hararet, or hot room, a magnificent domed space with a large heated marble platform called a gobek tasha, belly stone, in the centre. Here's where the real action happened. You'd lie on this heated marble, which was kept at just the right temperature to be therapeutic but not burning, and let the heat work its magic, opening pores and loosening muscles. But you weren't just lying there. The telek for men, or natir for women, professional bath attendants would take over. These weren't minimum wage workers. They were skilled professionals who knew exactly how much pressure to apply, which areas needed extra attention, and how to read a body's needs through years of training. The kesi, a rough mitt made from goat hair or silk, would be used to exfoliate your entire body. And when I say exfoliate, I mean it. Dead skin would roll off in grey strips that would horrify and fascinate first-time visitors. It was aggressive, sometimes borderline painful, but the result was skin softer than a baby's. Then came the soap. Ottoman soap was special, made from olive oil and laurel oil. It was both cleansing and moisturising. The attendant would work up a lather so thick you'd disappear under a mountain of bubbles, then rinse you with bowls of water poured from just the right height to create the perfect pressure. The hammam was one of the few public spaces where women had complete freedom. Women's days at the hammam, or separate women's sections in larger establishments, were social extravaganzas. Mothers would scope out potential brides for their sons, examining them with a kind of detailed attention that would make modern background checks look superficial. These women's gatherings were elaborate affairs. They'd bring food, sometimes entire meals, turning the hammam into a picnic site. Musicians might be hired for special occasions. Henna artists would decorate hands and feet. It was spa day, girls' night out, and social networking event all in one. The hammam played a crucial role in Ottoman hygiene, which was remarkably advanced. In an era when many Europeans bathed rarely, Ottomans were washing thoroughly at least once a week, often more. This wasn't just cultural preference. Islamic law required cleanliness for prayer, and the hammam made this religious obligation into a pleasurable social institution. Medical treatments were common in hammams. Barber surgeons would perform bloodletting and cupping. Bone setters would work on aching joints. Some hammams had specialists in traditional medicine who would prescribe various treatments based on the theory of bodily humours. It was healthcare, Ottoman style, preventative, holistic, and surprisingly effective for many conditions. The hammam was also where life's major events were celebrated. Before weddings, brides would have elaborate hammam parties with their female relatives and friends. New mothers would be honoured with special hammam visits 40 days after giving birth. Even death had its hammam rituals, with bodies being washed in special sections before burial. Different neighbourhoods had different calibre hammams. The imperial hammams were architectural masterpieces with multiple domes, intricate tile work and marble imported from across the empire. Neighbourhood hammams were simpler but no less important to community life. The poorest areas might share a single, basic hammam, but even there the principle remained. Cleanliness was not a luxury, but a necessity. The economics of the hammam were fascinating. Many were built as charitable foundations, waqfs, with profits funding mosques, schools or other public services. Entry fees were scaled by economic status. Wealthy patrons subsidised poorer ones. Some sultans' wives built magnificent hammams specifically for the poor, considering it a religious duty. The hammam also created employment for thousands. Beyond the attendants, there were stokers feeding the furnaces, water carriers, laundry workers washing the towels, masseurs, barbers, and even musicians and food vendors who served the waiting areas. An entire economy revolved around getting clean. Privacy in the hammam followed strict but practical rules. Nudity was normal, trying to bathe clothed would have been seen as bizarre, but certain protocols were followed. Men kept a towel wrapped around their waist called a peshtimal. Women had more flexibility but generally maintained some covering. The focus was on cleanliness, not exhibition. The hammam influenced Ottoman concepts of privacy and public space in profound ways. Bodies that were carefully concealed in public were exposed in the hammam, but in a context that desexualized nudity through routine and ritual. It was a space where physical humanity was acknowledged without shame or excessive prudery. As the day ended and bathers emerged into the cool evening air, they carried with them more than just cleanliness. They carried news, sealed deals, strengthened friendships, and reinforced the social bonds that held Ottoman society together. The hammam wasn't just about washing bodies, it was about maintaining the social fabric of an empire. The decline of traditional hammam culture in the modern era represents more than just a change in bathing habits. It marks the loss of a social institution that provided community, healthcare, and human connection in a way that no modern spa or gym can quite replicate. The Ottomans understood something we've forgotten, that cleanliness of body and community health are inseparable. Ottoman cuisine wasn't just about eating, it was about creating an entire universe of flavours that reflected an empire spanning 3 continents. The Ottoman kitchen was where East met West, where nomadic traditions merged with agricultural abundance, and where simple ingredients were transformed into complex symphonies of taste that would influence world cuisine for centuries to come. The Ottoman day revolved around 3 main meals, but the timing might surprise you. Breakfast, as we discussed, was early and light. Lunch was the main meal, usually eaten around what we'd call late morning or early afternoon. Dinner was lighter, eaten after evening prayers, but the real story isn't when they ate, but what they ate and how they ate it. Let's start with the cornerstone of Ottoman cuisine, bread. The Ottomans were absolutely obsessed with bread. Istanbul alone had over 300 types of bread, each with its own name, shape, and purpose. There was the everyday samoon, a white loaf that was regulated so strictly that bakers who made it too small could be punished. The simit, that sesame-covered ring that still dominates Turkish streets today, was already a breakfast favourite 500 years ago, but the real star was peed, the boat-shaped flatbread that served as both food and plate. During Ramadan, special peeds would be baked with extra care, marked with beautiful patterns, and the smell of baking pied at sunset became one of the sensory memories that defined the holy month for millions. The palace kitchen, of course, took things to another level. The Topkapi Palace Kitchen employed over 1,300 people at its peak, divided into specialised sections, one for soups, one for desserts, one for pickles, one just for the Sultan's food. The palace consumed 30,000 chickens, 23,000 sheep, and 14,000 pounds of rice per month. These weren't just cooks. They were culinary artists creating edible propaganda for the empire's power. Rice arrived with the Ottomans and transformed Middle Eastern cuisine. The Ottomans elevated rice from a simple grain to an art form. There were dozens of pilaf variations, with currants and pine nuts, with liver and onions, with chestnuts and lamb. Each region had its signature rice dish, and preparing perfect rice, each grain separate, never mushy, was considered the mark of a skilled cook. The Ottoman approach to meat was interesting. Unlike modern Turkish cuisine, which features a lot of grilled meat, Ottoman cooking favoured stews and braises. Meat was expensive, so it was used strategically. A little lamb might flavour an entire pot of vegetables. The tandir, a clay oven buried in the ground, would slow cook lamb until it fell off the bone, creating dishes that were both economical and delicious. But here's something surprising. Ottoman cuisine was remarkably vegetable forward. They had over 40 ways to prepare eggplant alone. Dolma, stuffed vegetables, could be made with everything from grape leaves to quinces. The Ottoman garden wasn't just ornamental, it was a source of incredible biodiversity, growing vegetables we've forgotten existed. The mez culture, small plates shared before the main meal, was Ottoman innovation at its finest. These weren't appetizers in our sense. They were a social institution. A proper mez spread might include dozens of dishes. Smooth hummus, smoky baba ganoush, tangy yogurt with herbs, pickled everything, fresh cheeses, olives in countless preparations. The point wasn't to fill up but to enhance conversation, each bite designed to complement both the last and the next. Yogurt deserves its own mention. The Ottomans didn't invent yogurt. Nomadic Turks had been making it for centuries, but they elevated it to a culinary essential. They had drinking yogurt, ayran, cooking yogurt, strained yogurt, süzme, and dried yogurt for travel. They used it in soups, sauces, marinades, and desserts. Yogurt was medicine, preservative, and flavour enhancer all in one. The Ottoman sweet tooth was legendary. Baklava, that paper-thin pastry layered with nuts and drowned in syrup, reached its pinnacle in Ottoman palace kitchens. But baklava was just the beginning. There was kunefe, cheese pastry soaked in syrup. Lokma, fried dough balls that were distributed free during celebrations. Helva in countless varieties, from flour-based to sesame. Turkish delight, lokum, deserves special attention. This jewel-like confection, flavoured with rose, lemon or mastic, wasn't just candy. It was diplomacy. Boxes of lokum accompanied Ottoman ambassadors, serving as edible introductions to Ottoman refinement. The secret to perfect lokum, achieving that perfect tender firm texture, was guarded as closely as state secrets. The Ottomans were also history's great preservers. They pickled everything: cabbage, peppers, garlic, even unripe almonds. These weren't just condiments, they were survival food, ensuring vegetables were available year-round. The turşu, just pickle seller, was a fixture in every neighbourhood, his shop lined with glass jars containing vegetables in rainbow colours. Drinks in the Ottoman Empire were their own universe. Since alcohol was officially forbidden, though often privately enjoyed, the Ottomans developed an incredible range of non-alcoholic beverages. Sherbet, from which we get sherbet and sorbet, came in flavours we can barely imagine. Violet, tamarind, rose hip, pomegranate flower. These weren't just drinks, they were liquid poetry, served in delicate glasses and associated with hospitality and refinement. Boza, that mildly fermented millet drink, occupied a curious position. Technically it contained alcohol, about 1%, but it was sold openly because it was also nutritious and warming in winter. Boza sellers would walk the streets on cold nights, their distinctive cry echoing through empty streets, providing comfort in a cup. The coffee culture we discussed earlier had its own culinary accompaniments. A proper cup of coffee always came with a glass of water to cleanse the palate, and a piece of lokum or a small sweet. The order of consumption mattered: water first, then coffee, then the sweet, creating a perfect progression of flavours. Food preparation in Ottoman households was intensely seasonal. Spring meant wild greens and herbs, gathered from hillsides and turned into salads and bureks, savoury pastries. Summer brought tomatoes and peppers for making paste that would last through winter. Fall was for quinces and pomegranates, winter for dried fruits and nuts. The Ottoman kitchen was also surprisingly concerned with food as medicine. Every spice had medicinal properties: cinnamon for digestion, ginger for cold conditions, black seed for everything. Meals were composed with an eye toward balancing hot and cold, wet and dry properties, following theories inherited from ancient Greek and Islamic medicine. Special occasions had special foods. During Ramadan, dates and water broke the fast, followed by soup, then a parade of special dishes prepared only during the holy month. The two sheep festivals, Eid, meant the distribution of meat to the poor. Every part used, nothing wasted. Weddings featured mountains of pilaf topped with whole roasted lambs. Women held the real culinary knowledge. While palace kitchens were staffed by men, home cooking was women's domain. Recipes were rarely written, they were demonstrated, handed down from mother to daughter-in-law, each generation adding its own subtle modifications. A family's reputation could rest on grandmother's burek recipe, or mother's pickled vegetables. The Ottoman table wasn't just about food, it was about hospitality. Refusing food was almost insulting. Guests were plied with dish after dish, tea after tea, sweet after sweet. The host who let a guest leave hungry had failed in a fundamental duty. This wasn't just politeness. It was a deep cultural value that saw feeding others as a religious and social obligation. Regional variations were enormous. Anatolian villages might subsist on bulgur, yogurt and wild herbs. Coastal cities feasted on fish, prepared in ways that would make modern sushi chefs jealous. Arab provinces contributed their own traditions, the Levantine love of olive oil, Egyptian fulmadames, North African couscous variations. The spice trade that made the Ottomans rich also made their food extraordinary. Black pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, saffron from Persia. These weren't just seasonings but symbols of imperial reach. The ability to season food with spices from across the known world was a daily reminder of Ottoman power. Even eating implements told a story. The Ottomans ate with spoons and bread. Forks were a European innovation they viewed with suspicion. Eating with one's hands, the right hand only, was perfectly acceptable and even preferred for certain foods. The communal nature of eating, everyone sharing from central plates, reinforced social bonds with every meal. As the empire declined, its cuisine didn't disappear, it dispersed, influencing food from the Balkans to the Middle East. What we call Greek, Armenian, Arab, or Balkan cuisine today all bear the Ottoman stamp. The empire might have fallen, but its flavours live on in every bite of baklava in Athens, every sip of coffee in Belgrade, every dollop of yogurt in Damascus. The Ottoman kitchen wasn't just preparing food, it was maintaining an empire one meal at a time. Through food, they created a shared culture that transcended language, religion, and ethnicity. In a world that was often divided, the Ottoman table brought people together, proving that perhaps the most powerful force in human history isn't armies or ideas, but a perfectly seasoned dish shared with others. When you lived in the Ottoman Empire, what you wore wasn't just about fashion or comfort. It was a complex language that broadcast your profession, social status, religious affiliation, and even your neighbourhood to anyone who knew how to read the signs. Ottoman clothing was a walking autobiography, a textile declaration of identity that made modern designer labels look subtle by comparison. Let's start with the basics that everyone wore. The traditional Ottoman outfit began with the shalva, those baggy trousers that could fit a whole sheep inside, and sometimes did, according to smuggling stories. These weren't just comfortable, they were practical for a society where sitting cross-legged on floors and cushions was the norm. Try doing that in modern skinny jeans and you'll understand why the Ottomans stuck with their billowing pants for 600 years. On top came the gumlek, a long shirt that reached the knees, usually white linen or cotton. Over this went the intari, a robe that could range from simple cotton for workers to elaborate silk brocades for the wealthy. The key was layering, not just for warmth, but because each layer told a part of your story. The kaftan, that iconic Ottoman garment, was where things got really interesting. A simple kaftan might be wool or cotton, but a wealthy merchant's could be silk decorated with gold thread. Palace kaftans were works of art. Some surviving examples have over 100,000 hand-sewn pearls. The Sultan's kaftans were so valuable they were counted among the imperial treasures. Colours weren't random choices, they were regulated by law. Green was reserved for descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Jewish subjects traditionally wore yellow or blue. Christians often wore black or dark blue. Muslims had the widest palette, but even they had restrictions. Bright red was for the very wealthy, purple was essentially imperial. A merchant who dressed above his station might find himself in serious trouble. The turban situation was incredibly complex. The Ottoman turban wasn't just headwear, it was a sophisticated communication system. The size, colour and wrapping style indicated everything from your job to your sect of Islam. Judges wore huge white turbans that could weigh several pounds. Military officers had their own distinctive styles. Even the way you positioned the fold could signal your political leanings. The introduction of the fez in the 19th century was actually a radical modernisation attempt. Sultan Mahmud II abolished the turban for government officials and introduced the fez as a modern alternative. The irony is that what we now see as traditionally Ottoman was actually their attempt to westernise. The fez was meant to be egalitarian. Everyone wore the same hat. But people immediately found ways to signal status through tassel quality and the precise angle of wearing. Women's clothing was even more complex. The basic elements were similar, shalvar, gomlek and tari, but the variations were endless. Wealthy women might wear 6 or 7 layers, each one visible at sleeves and hems, creating a rainbow effect. The fabrics alone could bankrupt a middle-class family. Silk from Bursa, velvet from Italy, fur from Russia, cotton from Egypt. The Ottoman woman's wardrobe changed dramatically depending on whether she was at home or in public. At home, especially in the harem, women wore surprisingly revealing clothes by the standards of the time, light, flowing garments that prioritised comfort and ease of movement. Some European visitors were shocked to find Ottoman women at home, dressed more liberally than European women at balls. But stepping outside required the firas, a coat-like overgarment, and various forms of veiling. The face veil wasn't originally an Ottoman tradition. It was adopted from Byzantine and Persian customs. Different styles indicated different things. The yashmak, a double veil that covered the lower face while leaving the eyes visible, was standard for urban women. The piece was a more complete covering. Rural women often went unveiled entirely, considering it a luxury they couldn't afford while working in fields. Jewellery wasn't just decoration, it was a woman's personal wealth and insurance policy. Since women could own property independently under Ottoman law, their jewellery represented economic independence. The jewellery sewn onto clothing and headdresses wasn't just showing off. It was a walking bank account that couldn't be seized by creditors or claimed by male relatives. Children dressed like miniature adults, but with some practical modifications. Boys wore simplified versions of men's clothing, though they might not get their first proper turban until reaching adolescence. Girls dressed like their mothers, but in brighter colours. Childhood was one of the few times Ottoman women could wear really vibrant hues without social judgment. The guilds each had their distinctive dress codes. A baker wore a specific type of apron and cap. A janissary soldier had his famous tall white cap with its hanging flap. Even the water carriers had their leather outfits that marked them instantly in a crowd. You could tell someone's profession from across a crowded bazaar just by their silhouette. Seasonal changes meant wardrobe changes that went beyond just adding layers. Winter brought out the furs, and the type of fur showed your exact social position. Sable was for the Sultan and his immediate family, ermine for the highest officials, fox for wealthy merchants, rabbit for the middle class, sheepskin for everyone else. Wearing the wrong fur was social suicide. Footwear was equally coded. The colour of your shoes or boots indicated your religion in many periods. The height of your heel might show your profession. Janissaries wore flat boots for fighting, while palace officials wore elevated shoes to keep their robes clean. The pointed toe of your slipper could indicate your regional origin. The bathhouse outfit was its own category. The peshtamal, bath wrap, wasn't just functional. Wealthy bathers had elaborate versions with gold thread embroidery. The takunya, wooden bath clogs, might be inlaid with mother of pearl. Even the bath bundle, the bocha containing your bathing supplies, was a status symbol with elaborate embroidered covers. Ottoman pockets deserve special mention because they didn't have any, at least not sewn into clothes. Instead, people carried separate pouches tied around their waists under their robes. Women's pouches were often elaborately decorated and given as wedding gifts. Men's pouches ranged from simple leather to jewel-encrusted works of art. The Ottoman approach to fashion renovation was ingenious. Clothes were never thrown away, they were transformed. An old kaftan became a child's outfit. Worn entaris were cut down into household items. Even the Sultan's old clothes weren't discarded but given to favoured courtiers. Wearing a garment the Sultan had worn was an incredible honour. Special occasions demanded special clothes. A circumcision ceremony might require an entirely new outfit for the whole family. Ramadan had its own fashion requirements. Lighter colours, looser fits to accommodate the feast and fast cycle. Wedding clothes could take months to prepare, and might be the most expensive thing a family ever purchased. The influence of Ottoman fashion spread far beyond the empire. The dolman jacket adopted by European military uniforms came from Ottoman cavalry. The paisley pattern originated in Ottoman textile designs. What we call Oriental luxury in European fashion was often Ottoman influence filtered through Venice and Vienna. As the empire modernised in the 19th century, clothing became a battleground between tradition and change. The Tanzimat reforms encouraged Western dress for men, but left women's clothing largely unchanged, creating the odd situation where a husband might wear a European suit while his wife dressed like her great-grandmother. The end of traditional Ottoman dress wasn't gradual, it was legislated. The Turkish Republic banned traditional male headwear in 1925, forcing men to wear European-style hats. Women's veiling was discouraged, though not officially banned. Within a generation, centuries of clothing tradition vanished from public life, surviving only in museums and folk festivals. But Ottoman clothing influence never really disappeared. Every time someone throws on a cosy kaftan, wraps themselves in a shawl, or admires the flow of wide-legged pants, they're unknowingly honouring the Ottoman understanding that clothing should be both beautiful and comfortable, both personal expression and social communication. The way Ottomans dressed reveals something profound about their society. They understood that identity is performed, that clothing creates community, and that what we wear shapes not just how others see us, but how we see ourselves. In an empire of dozens of ethnicities and religions, clothing was the common language everyone could speak and read. In Ottoman society, the working day wasn't measured by clocks on the wall, but by the sun's journey across the sky, and the 5 daily calls to prayer that divided time into meaningful segments. This created a rhythm of work that modern efficiency experts would find maddening, but the Ottomans found perfectly natural. A flow that balanced productivity with prayer, commerce with community, ambition with acceptance of divine will. The Ottoman craftsman's day began before dawn, not with the jarring buzz of an alarm, but with the melodious call of the muezzin. By the time the morning prayer ended, workshop fires were being lit, tools were being arranged, and the serious business of creating was underway. But here's what's remarkable. There was no rush. Ottoman craftsmen didn't punch time cards or race against quotas. They worked steadily, methodically, with a rhythm that prioritised quality over quantity. The guild system that governed most Ottoman trades was like a combination of trade union, quality control board, and social club. Every profession, from goldsmithing to grave digging, had its guild, with strict rules about everything from pricing to production methods. You couldn't just decide to become a shoemaker. You had to apprentice for years, produce a masterpiece to prove your skill, and be accepted by the guild masters. Apprenticeship in Ottoman trades was intense. Young boys, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, would enter a master's workshop not just to learn a trade, but to absorb an entire way of life. They'd start with the most menial tasks: sweeping floors, fetching materials, serving tea to customers. Gradually over years they'd be allowed to touch the tools, then use them under supervision, then finally create their own work. The relationship between master and apprentice wasn't just professional, it was almost familial. Masters were responsible for their apprentices' moral education, as well as their professional training. They'd ensure the boys attended prayer, stayed out of trouble, and learned the ethical dimensions of their trade. Many apprentices lived with their masters, becoming part of the household. The journeyman phase, called Kalfa, was where young craftsmen proved themselves. They could work independently but couldn't open their own shops. This period, which might last a decade or more, was about perfecting skills and building reputation. A good Kalfa was like gold to a master craftsman, skilled enough to handle complex work but still under the master's authority. Becoming a master craftsman required creating a masterpiece, literally a piece that proved mastery. This wasn't just technically proficient work, it had to show innovation, artistry, and deep understanding of the craft. The guildmasters would examine it with the kind of scrutiny we'd associate with doctoral dissertations. Failure meant more years as a journeyman. The physical workspace of Ottoman craftsmen was fascinating. Workshops were usually small, street-facing shops where work happened in full view of passing customers. This transparency wasn't accidental. It was quality control through public scrutiny. A carpenter planing wood badly, a baker skimping on ingredients, a metalworker using inferior materials, all would be immediately visible to potential customers. Tools were treasured possessions, often passed down through generations. An Ottoman craftsman's toolkit was both practical and sacred. Many tools were inscribed with protective prayers or verses from the Quran. Before beginning particularly challenging work, a craftsman might pray over his tools, asking for divine guidance in their use. The rhythm of the working day was punctuated by prayer breaks. When the call to prayer sounded, work stopped. Tools were set down mid-stroke, conversations paused mid-sentence, and craftsmen headed to the mosque or prayed in their shops. This might seem disruptive to modern sensibilities, but it created natural breaks that prevented the kind of repetitive stress injuries common in industrial work. Lunch wasn't the hurried sandwich at the desk we know today. Midday meal was often communal, with neighbouring shopkeepers sharing food, discussing business, and maintaining the social bonds that made commercial districts function as communities. A successful merchant might regularly feed his poorer neighbours, considering it both religious duty and smart business. Today's charity recipient might be tomorrow's customer. The afternoon hours, especially in summer, often saw a slowdown. The Ottoman workday adapted to the climate. In hot regions, the hours after noon prayer might be quiet, with shops closing or operating minimally until the day cooled. This wasn't laziness, it was practical adaptation to environmental realities. Customer relations in Ottoman commerce were intensely personal. The idea of anonymous transactions would have seemed bizarre. Customers had their baker, their butcher, their tailor. These relationships might span generations. A craftsman would know not just a customer's preferences, but their family history, their financial situation, their social connections. Quality control wasn't left to market forces. The muhtasib, market inspector, regularly checked workshops and stores. Using false weights, adulterating products, or producing substandard goods could result in public humiliation, fines, or expulsion from the guild. The Ottoman commercial system assumed that left unchecked, greed would destroy both quality and community trust. The fascinating thing about Ottoman guilds was their social insurance function. If a craftsman fell ill, his guild brothers would support his family. If he died, they'd ensure his widow and children were cared for, often training his sons in the trade. Guild funds, built from member contributions, provided a safety net that predated modern social security by centuries. Competition between craftsmen was regulated to prevent destructive price wars. Guilds set standard prices that balanced fair profit for craftsmen with affordability for customers. Undercutting competitors wasn't clever business. It was anti-social behaviour that could get you expelled from the guild. The goal was sustainability for all, not domination by a few. Women's participation in Ottoman crafts was more significant than often acknowledged. While they couldn't join most guilds, women dominated certain trades, particularly textiles and food production. Many women ran businesses from their homes, producing goods that their husbands or male relatives would sell. The invisible female economy was crucial to Ottoman prosperity. The end of the workday wasn't determined by a clock but by the evening prayer. As the call echoed across the city, shops would begin closing, but closure was gradual. Regular customers might still be served, ongoing negotiations would be concluded, tea would be finished. The Ottoman workday faded rather than stopped, easing into evening rather than abruptly ending. Evening work existed but was different. Some trades, particularly food vendors, worked into the night. Others might do preparation work at home, but the idea of working continuously into the night was generally seen as unhealthy and possibly impious. Night was for family, rest and contemplation, not commerce. The weekly rhythm mattered too. Friday, the Muslim day of congregation, saw reduced business hours. Markets might close entirely during Friday prayers, but this wasn't a full day of rest like the Jewish Sabbath or Christian Sunday. Business resumed after prayers. Different religious communities had different weekly rhythms, creating a complex commercial calendar. Seasonal variations were dramatic. Ramadan transformed the working schedule completely. Work started even earlier, but ended earlier too, allowing preparation for the fast-breaking meal. Night markets thrived during Ramadan. with some craftsmen earning a significant portion of their annual income during the holy month. The craft tradition produced objects of stunning beauty and utility. An Ottoman craftsman didn't just make things, he created artifacts that would last generations. The pride in workmanship, the patience with detail, the acceptance that some things simply took as long as they took. All of this produced a material culture of extraordinary richness. What strikes me most about Ottoman working life is its integration. Work wasn't separate from religious life, social life, or family life. It was all interwoven. A craftsman was simultaneously businessman, artist, guild brother, neighbourhood figure, and faithful Muslim, or Christian or Jew. The artificial divisions we create between different aspects of life didn't exist. The decline of the guild system in the 19th century, under pressure from European industrial competition, didn't just change how Ottomans worked, it transformed Ottoman society. The loss of guild protection, communal workspace, and regulated competition created social disruptions that contributed to the empire's eventual collapse. Today's gig economy workers, struggling without benefits or job security, might recognise themselves in the post-guild Ottoman craftsmen who suddenly found themselves competing in an unregulated market. The Ottoman guild system, for all its restrictions, provided something we're still trying to figure out: how to balance individual ambition with collective well-being, efficiency with humanity, profit with purpose. The Ottoman approach to education might surprise modern readers who assume Islamic societies were anti-intellectual. In fact, the Ottomans created one of history's most comprehensive educational systems, blending religious instruction with practical skills, classical knowledge with contemporary needs, creating a literate, numerate population that could run an empire spanning 3 continents. Education in the Ottoman Empire started young and started everywhere. The neighbourhood mektep, primary school, was as common as the local mosque. Often they were the same building. Every Muslim child, regardless of economic status, was expected to attend. These weren't elite institutions. They were neighbourhood schools where the butcher's son sat next to the judge's daughter, learning the same fundamental lessons. The curriculum at the mektep was basic but solid: reading, writing, arithmetic and Quranic recitation. But don't imagine rote memorization without understanding. Ottoman educational philosophy emphasized comprehension alongside memorization. Students learned to read using the Quran, but they also learned what the words meant, how sentences were constructed, why grammar mattered. The physical setup of Ottoman classrooms would seem bizarre to modern eyes. Students sat cross-legged on carpets around the teacher, who occupied a slightly raised platform. There were no desks, no blackboards, just students with their wooden writing boards covered in wax, which could be smoothed over and reused, the Ottoman equivalent of an irascible tablet. Teachers, called hoca, occupied an interesting social position. They weren't particularly well paid, often surviving on small fees from parents and occasional gifts, but they were deeply respected. A teacher who had taught you to read held a lifelong claim on your respect. Former students would visit their age teachers, bringing gifts and seeking advice decades after leaving school. Girls' education was more complex than often portrayed. While they might not attend the same mekteps as boys after a certain age, many received education at home or in special schools attached to mosques. Wealthy families hired private tutors for their daughters. The Ottoman Empire produced remarkable female scholars, poets, and even legal experts, though their contributions were often overlooked by historians. The Madris system, higher education, was where the Ottoman educational machine really showed its sophistication. These weren't just religious seminaries, they were universities that taught law, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy alongside religious studies. The greatest madrasas in Istanbul rivaled any European university of the time. Students at madrasas received free education, room, and board. Yes, free. The entire system was funded by religious endowments, waqfs. A successful merchant might fund a madris as a charitable act, ensuring generations of students could study without worrying about tuition. It was scholarship system that put modern student loans to shame. The curriculum at advanced madrasas was remarkably broad. A student might study Arabic grammar in the morning, Islamic law before noon, Aristotelian logic after lunch, and Persian poetry in the evening. The Ottoman educated class wasn't narrowly trained. They were polymaths who could discuss theology, compose poetry, solve mathematical problems, and navigate legal complexities. Medical education deserves special mention. Ottoman medical schools combined Islamic medical traditions with Greek texts and contemporary observations. Students didn't just memorize Galen and Ibn Sina, they practiced in hospitals, observed surgeries, and even conducted what we'd recognize as clinical rounds. The Süleymaniye Medical Medreyi in Istanbul had a teaching hospital attached where students gained practical experience. The Palace School at Topkapı was perhaps the most remarkable educational institution in the empire. Here, young boys recruited through the Devshirm system. Christians converted to Islam and trained for government service received an education that would make modern elite prep schools jealous. Languages, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, sometimes European languages, mathematics, history, art, music, physical education, and intensive training in administration and military science. What's fascinating is how practical Ottoman education could be. Students learning mathematics didn't just study abstract theories. They learned surveying for construction, accounting for commerce, and astronomical calculations for determining prayer times. Education was always connected to real-world application. The Ottoman Empire was multilingual by necessity, and education reflected this. In Arab provinces, education might begin in Arabic. In Balkan territories, local languages were used alongside Turkish. The empire never attempted to impose linguistic uniformity through education. Turkish was the administrative language, but local languages were preserved and often taught. Books in the Ottoman Empire were precious objects before printing became widespread. Students often copied texts by hand as part of their education, creating their own libraries one manuscript at a time. This wasn't just economical, it was pedagogical. The act of copying forced deep engagement with texts, ensuring students really understood what they were transcribing. When printing finally arrived, the Ottomans were initially suspicious, not of the technology itself, but of its implications. They worried about error propagation, one mistake would be copied thousands of times, and quality control. The first Ottoman printing press, established by Ibrahim Müteferrika in 1727, had to get religious approval for every book it printed. Libraries were central to Ottoman educational culture. Major mosques had libraries attached, open to all literate people regardless of religion. The librarian was a respected position, part scholar, part teacher, part guardian of knowledge. Some libraries had special chains to keep valuable books from walking away, but they were still available for consultation. The Ottoman approach to vocational education was remarkably sophisticated. The guild apprenticeship system we discussed earlier was essentially vocational training par excellence. But there were also specialised schools for particular professions, scribal schools for future bureaucrats, military engineering schools for army officers, even schools for court musicians. Languages were taught through immersion and practice rather than grammar drills. A student learning Arabic might spend months just listening to Arabic poetry before attempting to speak. Persian was taught through reading classical texts. European languages, when they were taught, came with cultural education. You didn't just learn French, you learned French manners, French history, French ways of thinking. Physical education wasn't neglected. Wrestling was considered essential for character building. Archery was both practical skill and spiritual practice. The Ottomans had complex philosophies about the relationship between drawing a bow and achieving spiritual focus. Swimming was taught wherever possible, with special pools built for education in cities far from natural water. The Ottoman educational system produced remarkable intellectual achievements. Ottoman astronomers built sophisticated observatories and made careful celestial observations. Ottoman mathematicians contributed to algebra and geometry. Ottoman historians created detailed chronicles that are still essential sources today. This wasn't a civilization in intellectual decline. It was vibrant and creative until quite late in its history. Women's education, while restricted, produced remarkable figures. Mihri Hatun, a 15th century female poet, ran her own literary salon. Fatma Aliye Topuz, writing in the 19th century, became one of the first female novelists in the Islamic world. These weren't exceptions that proved the rule. They were tips of an iceberg of female intellectual activity that historians are only now beginning to uncover. The decline of the traditional Ottoman educational system in the 19th century was traumatic. Western-style schools were introduced alongside traditional madrasas. creating two parallel systems that produced graduates who could barely communicate with each other. The unified educational culture that had helped hold the empire together, fragmented into competing visions of what knowledge meant. What's remarkable about Ottoman education is how it balanced seemingly contradictory goals. It was deeply religious, yet practically oriented. It preserved classical knowledge while adapting to contemporary needs. It maintained high standards while providing broad access. It respected tradition while producing innovation. The Ottoman educational legacy lives on in unexpected ways. The emphasis on memorization combined with understanding influences educational approaches across the former Ottoman territories. The Waqf system of educational funding inspired similar charitable educational foundations worldwide. The idea that education should be free for talented students regardless of background. That's an Ottoman concept that we now take for granted. In our age of educational crisis, rising tuition costs and debates about curriculum, the Ottoman example offers interesting perspectives. They understood education as a public good, not a private commodity. They saw no contradiction between religious and secular knowledge. They believed that a truly educated person needed both practical skills and cultural refinement. Perhaps most importantly, they understood that education wasn't just about individual advancement, but about maintaining civilization itself.